dang, this is bad. So my stream today is called What Will Come Next? Good Intentions. Because it's kind of like to say the road to hell is paved with good intentions. But you never know what's going to happen next. Obviously, there's one thing that's certain, right? And that's traffic. We are going to have a tons of traffic. It's never going to end. It's never going to end. And that's just how things are going to be. I don't know. What will happen next? Will things get better or will they keep getting worse? Certainly, a lot of people think things are getting worse and will continue to get worse. And I mean, I tend to think that way, but maybe not. Certainly there's a lot of agency involved, right? Like the idea that somebody can change, the direction of something through, a course of actions, whether, it's intentional, right? Or you just end up, powering through things, right? Like it's this fun idea of agency, right? Whether or not people are able to use their mind and their thoughts to focus themselves and to make the world a better place, or alternately make it worse for everybody. So I don't know. We'll see if this brings any sort of discussion or not. Obviously, you want to think, right, that like there is a goodness to human beings, right? That they can improve things for the better. That not everything, right, is nihilistic or fatalistic. But I mean, I think that certainly some people who act like they have good intentions don't. Certainly there's a lot of very badly intended people out there who are, out to, break the law, commit crimes, who are, engaged in greed. I just got an LA Times headline, right, about the White House ordering firing of a federal prosecutor for a fat burger, case with the CEO or something. I mean, come on now. How rampant is corruption, right? That, things are just this way that basically everybody thinks everything is corrupt. And to want to be an optimist in the 21st century in the United States takes a lot of sort of positivity that's hard to, reconcile. And you don't have to be making the choice, right, between traffic jam, the toll lanes, and the other toll lanes to realize that there is some serious concerns about the viability of our population, right? This is not a sustainable course that we're on, and our ability to change things kind of depends upon us. I think it's easy to blame, immigrants in foreign countries, to, blame each other, but the ability that we have to course correct into something more positive, so often seems quite limited. So this is what we're doing. This is a discussion point. If people want to have this discussion, I think it's a good discussion that you can have. You don't have to be in the car to have a long, winded philosophical discussion. You can have philosophical thoughts on your own. Or maybe I'm just a deep thinker. I think generally speaking that a lot of people think very shallow. They are focused on very day-to-day things. They're focused on their own immediate gain and their reputation. They are not focused on making a better world, right? Much less taking any risk, right? Or spending anything unnecessarily to make a better world, right? Altruism is not something that people engage in. People will even engage in malicious acts, right? That they think are self-benefiting because they think, generally speaking, that they're going to get away with it. And so many people do get away with so many things, you can't blame them, right? Isn't that kind of the supposition that bad deeds earn rewards and that good intentions, right, are not welcome in our society? And certainly people have said, right, that a lot of people kind of knew that Trump was a felon, and yet they still voted for Trump. And as Trump further alienates, right, people both on left and right, as well as foreign countries, right, that this is not especially ones who were our friends, that this is not the way to move things forward. This is not the way to get things done. So do we have a choice? Can we choose, right, to have a world in which good intentions matter? Or, are we simply giving up to the idea that bad intentions are okay? And I think you see a mix of, opinion about this. Certainly some people think, right, that, we're going to rally around, some sort of collective positive good and head in a better direction versus continuing to flounder and to struggle as a society, right? Piling up debt, destroying our environment, tearing each other apart, hurting ourselves, hurting our friends. That this is a hot mess that we live in, right? So like either you kind of like think that like things are, repairable in some type of way, or maybe they're not as bad, as people put on. But arguably, I think on both sides, left and right, people are not satisfied with where we are at today. And that is really kind of the challenge that we have. And I think the worst thing you can be, right, is like a moderate. Like nobody wants a moderate, right? Like, and people who study Congress, they know this. They know, right, that over time, the two sides have become so polarized, right, that the people who would be the moderates, right, don't, compromise. The history of compromise in our government that goes back for centuries, that was a positive thing you can read highlighted in, say, JFK's Profiles in Courage. That type of deal making is gone. And like certainly like the most symbolic person, right, perhaps of that was John McCain. And of course, John McCain famously voted to save Obamacare, and really upset Trump because he was, the deciding vote. And of course, Trump hated John McCain. Certainly some other people, have their issues with McCain, but he had like this pathological hatred of John McCain, who was otherwise, despite coming from, wealth and privilege, had, honorably served his country in Vietnam, had, refused to, take a deal to get out of, his personal, imprisonment when he could have, and who was widely regarded as one of the greatest American patriots, right? So you have like kind of two figures who are diametrically opposed, right? But, I think a lot of people go, well, they're both conservative Republicans, like how can they hate each other so much? And maybe Trump is just, such a circus, this is where we are going at, but it is deeply problematic and it filters into, kind of everyday lives. And like, it's not to say that America has always made sense, because that's certainly not the case. There's a long history of extremely random and troubled political belief in this country. And that is something that's probably understudied. You can go back to the Know Nothings, to William Jennings Bryan and the Silver Movement, people who wanted to fundamentally reshape the country through policymaking, whether it was through more exclusion or through changing the monetary system, but to really, really, really just turn things over, right? Recreate essentially the American wheel. And certainly one of my favorite moments in American history, right, is like the rise of Jacksonian democracy. President Andrew Jackson, a man of the people, the presidents before Jackson, they were, more from a patrician, right, background. And so Andrew Jackson, when he was elected president, takes the White House. He's a military, leader, and he gets a giant block of cheese, and he welcomes all the commoners in Washington, D.C. into the White House to have cheese, because cheese was a luxury good then. It was something that people enjoyed. So maybe that's kind of akin to like Trump, plastering the walls with gold and with figurines and trinkets, right? Maybe it's like that, but certainly, I think that obviously Trump is not from a commoner background. He's from, a background of extreme wealth. His father, Fred Trump, owned many, many buildings, was very wealthy. And in some ways, like, certainly the psychology of Trump is something that people have not considered fully. So often, right, people, you hear, right, that people think that he's sticking up for them. And yet so many things, right, like say like the vote on Obamacare, right, that would have, rolled back this landmark healthcare legislation that frankly did a lot of people a lot of good. before Obamacare, right, you could be rejected for pre-existing conditions. And so that's something, right, that both parties agree on now. That you shouldn't simply be denied health insurance because you have a pre-existing condition. And most Americans do have some type of pre-existing condition before they would deny you for any reason at all. And so really that like vote, right, that McCain did was like that compromise. That was something, right, that you think, if JFK, if he had blown out, would have, saluted, right? Like, hey, you crossed party lines as a Republican to save a Democratic health insurance reform package. And even though you knew you were going to suffer the wrath of this kind of intemperate man, one of those moments. It's kind of like if you were, to keep writing those chapters in Profiles in Courage by JFK, that's probably going to be one of them. But can something like that happen again, right? Like, is that where possible, or is it just all-out warfare, partisan warfare between two sides? And like certainly Gavin Newsom is really walking into this debate with his podcast. He is defending it. And certainly, like, it's an interesting defense to say, right, that, I want to talk to people who I disagree with without being disagreeable, and at the same time going the Democratic brand is toxic. I don't know if it's toxic, but I think certainly what was, the traditional Democratic Party message, right, of support for the common man, of health insurance programs, of education, of economic reform, that the Democratic Party today does not communicate that very well. I mean, I follow politics, and I couldn't have begun to tell you what Kamala Harris's position was on healthcare and education. Like, she just didn't communicate it very well. They turned it into kind of this democracy, litmus test. And, the answer right now is that people have essentially voted out democracy. And I don't know. I mean, Steve Bannon apparently was saying that if Trump, doesn't win again in 4 years, he's going to get put in jail. And it might be a little bit early for that. And of course, Steve Bannon might be a little bit of a nihilist. But I don't know. That's kind of the the crux of where things are at. And Governor Newsom was invited in court last Thursday to come to Los Angeles to take charge of the homelessness situation. If he's not too busy doing his podcast, he might consider being at the next federal court hearing in Los Angeles on homelessness, because it's probably one of the most important issues we have in California. As much fun as it's they're watching Karen Bass get grilled, I would love to see Gavin Newsom get grilled by a federal judge who's 80 plus years old and quite troublesome, and who thinks he can literally command the press. I mean, nobody can command the press. It does not work like that. The more you try to tell the press what to cover, generally speaking, the more they're going to go, nah, not like that, we're not. It's kind of just a thing to make yourself hard to corral. Nobody wants to be dictated to as far as, how they think about things, what their view is. That's kind of like the job. And like, of course, the free press, the history of the free press in the United States goes back even further than, frankly, the establishment of the United States of America. That battle for the right to have, the freedom of speech, the freedom of thought, the freedom of press is so, rooted in, going back to the 17th century even, that, personally, I, as a journalist, am reluctant to even begin to see ground on any story. Even when, it is, under pain of threat to me or my family, which has happened. And I find that very unacceptable, of course. But, do I let it control the story? Does might make right? Do we, simply accept right? The strong man, figure is what we need right in reality. Whether it's Trump or anybody else who wants to be the big, loud bully, who wants to set the course, who's going to be the person who's in charge, right? Through sheer, power of force, or, personality, is that the way to get to be a better country, right? Does the strong man save us? Or do we need, compromise and deliberation? And I'm not sure that some people want compromise. some people just want to watch the world burn, is what, Alfred tells Batman. And I don't know, that's totally wrong. Like, should the world just burn, right? And should anything be done, right, to get rid of people who might somehow obstruct a certain political faction, or a social movement or anything else from simply having its way, right? Like, what is the dividing line between might makes right and, compromise? Do we still need deliberation and debate, or should this just be a one-person show, right? Somebody's in charge, they are the decision maker, they're the boss, they are the kingpin, and you are not going to upset that for them. Like, is it a choice? Like, do we choose this, or does it simply happen to us? And, to get back to the idea of agency, of technical skill, of sort of, thought, does our ability to think this through, to have a discussion about this matter? Or is it simply, a fated right that, we are going to go off of this kind of like cliff and you'll never have to vote again, right? Is what he said, right? Good Christians of America, come together and elect me and you'll never have to vote again, right? Very fatalistic, very determinative, that is kind of the ending. And, if it was the end, would we even know? I don't know. It's a head scratcher. Definitely, one to get you thinking about, what people want to see. And like, certainly in ancient Rome, if you've ever been to the Colosseum, right, Rome's had gladiators, and, they literally threw the Christians, right, in with the lions, and that was the entertainment. Like, do people just want to be entertained? And, that sort of question, right? Like, are you not simply, entertained, is kind of what we're dealing with right now. It's politics as a blood sport, society, at a high degree of conflict, and not a lot of, getting along compromise. Do anything you can to destroy the perceived threat, slander them, undermine them, make them go away. And if all else fails, just try to destroy. We have a long history, particularly of assassination in this country. It's kind of unnerving. Taking your enemies, imprisoning people. I mean, thankfully, we're not like literally doing the lion thing where you feed your enemies to the lions, or, make people fight as gladiators for entertainment. But should we? Is this what people want to see, right? Do they just want to see people fighting? Or do they want to see something more productive and more positive, Is there an elegance to any of this? Is it have any, sort of redeeming factor as far as our kind of division, our mass social division between people who are the libs and people who are, the conservatives? Is it just going to be two factions, or is there a middle path? And, if there is a middle path, is that more dangerous perhaps than being with either one of the factions? Certainly nobody likes, somebody who is coming to upset their party or steal the show, right, from them, right? Like, nobody wants to see, somebody come out ahead of them. So does that justify kneecapping, any sort of compromise, solution, right? You just force people into their two camps, or can you work through this? But it's sort of a grand political debate. I don't know if we're going to see people compromising anymore. If political scientists are going to go, whoa, like, America is becoming more moderate. It's just started to moderate itself. It's balancing things out. It's achieving its goals. Things are getting better all the time. Like, will that just happen? Or, are we really stuck on this, like, it's going to get worse no matter what track? I'm curious to know what anybody, thinks about that. I think it kind of frames, some of these other topics too, that of course people want to discuss very intently. without getting into, specifics about like, who is, kind of like essentially, sort of mimicking, right? Like a larger debate, to draw out and elicit certain beliefs, right? Like, do we want the loud? Because loud seems to be winning. Loud is good. People want the loud. They want to feel, like we're going to battle. And, well, what happens after that battle, right? Like if you just like radicalize, your followers and you convince them, to follow you, into war, and you lose, what happens? And maybe you win. Some people think, they're going to win no matter what, of course, right? Like history's filled with people who thought they were going to win. I mean, Hitler thought he was going to win. The South, thought they were going to win. Great Britain thought it was going to win. And it just didn't work out that way, right? And like certainly this is something people say about America, is that sort of, even though it's a very troubled land with a lot of problems, that it's always tended to work through these issues and to generally get better from it. And particularly President Obama, right, really put forward that kind of argument that the course of American history was essentially positive, that things got better, right? Women gained the right to vote. He even accepted gay marriage, right? And now we're sliding back into, well, oh my God, the transgender people. Like, God forbid, two transgender people get married, or they play sports, or we talk about people, being Latinx. Like, that's too much for some people. Other people go like, great, let's make America more diverse, more tolerant, more unified, and it'll be better. And I mean, personally, I welcome different people. I think people should have the right to live their lives as they please. I don't think it's the government's business or, any sort of social faction's business to tell somebody how to live or to not live their life. Like, that is totalitarianism. And I kind of reject that, viewpoint, just as somebody who wants to have a free discussion and a free debate, to think that totalitarianism is the best form of government, perhaps. And Ben Franklin, right, said famously that democracy is, the worst form of government except for all the others. And I don't know, is it still a democracy, or has it become so corrupted, right? That it is not a functioning democracy. It's not a republic. It's like kind of a quasi-oligarchy feudalistic state where you're just happy to get your little bit. And, you might spend your entire life in poverty. Cool, right? Like the whole argument, right, about, uplifting everybody, the rising tide, that is becoming, quaint. Very quaint. The idea that we're all in this together is becoming very quaint. In fact, we are more separated, I think, with traffic being a really good example than ever before. People are literally just kind of in their cars. There goes a Cybertruck, and they don't have any sort of common, goals or lifestyle. And like occasionally it comes out, usually you have a big disaster or something, something goes wrong, somebody crashes the car and has to, be saved. And people go, well, this is a unifying moment, right? That the crisis brought us together. But it seems like mostly, right, this state of crisis that we're in is just tearing people apart. It's creating more division. And I mean, I guess you don't have to be on Hollywood Boulevard to understand, right, that, there's a lot of different people in America, and that on some level, right, we're all human beings. We all have a right to happiness, to the pursuit of happiness. And that, declaring, right, that there's only, say, two genders, right, male and female, might not be such a nice thing to do. And I mean, I personally don't have any family members who are, say, transgender, but I would be really, really worried about those people right now, given kind of the message that's being delivered, right, that you can't, have that identity. That is just, I think, where we kind of are struggling with basics. And I mean, to go back, right, to kind of like the history of the country, right? Like, we struggled, right, to get away from the idea that African Americans were 3/5 of a person. as far as the census count, right? That you could hold people as slaves. We had to literally pass a constitutional amendment to be like, no slaves. And we'd pass another one to say, okay, women, you can vote. Do we have to pass one right to, permit people to be transgender? I don't know. I guess, we'll know when people start speaking up. And I think on some level, right, a lot of the silence around, whether it's the anti-trans debate or, DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, like if you're not, speaking in favor of these things, does that mean you're against them, or does it simply mean you're compliant? What's up, Sassafras? You're a mother with a voice? Good. People should have a voice. It's really troublesome. I mean, I used to work in an educational institution, of course, University of Southern California, and USC is capitulating on this. We literally changed the diversity and equity inclusion, and that's our YouTube name, office to community. It's no longer diversity, it's community. And I mean, what I really worry about with that one are the students who are struggling with their identities, right? Who need, that sort of affirmation to find themselves in a world that comes off as uncaring, unmotherly perhaps. The one is going through the family court case, and that's how we're going to federal court. We have federal court on Thursday. I mean, the courts certainly have weighed in very heavily in the past on some of these issues. And generally, outside of one decision, right, which was Plessy versus Ferguson, that actually went against the idea, right, that we could have racial equality, that race was a factor worth respecting. We have generally had a progressive, path about this, right? Whether it's reforming, our policies to be more accepting, or to, permit people to be harmed. The judge we were trying to get refused. He just allowed a mother to castrate her third grade child. See, I mean, I think that's kind of, obviously, right, there's got to be some rights, right? Like, you have a right to define yourself, right? Like, telling kids who are struggling with their identity, that they can't be what they want to be is questionable, right? But it also comes into this kind of like parenting debate, right? Do parents have a right to control, their children? And some of them might want to harm them just like that. Some of them, certainly they say, okay, well, the school district shouldn't get between the parent and the kid, and that should be it. That's what like Rick Caruso said. Rick Caruso said, that relationship between the parent and the kid was important, but some people are abusive to their kids, right? She could not get the child sex change, not her. Obviously parents, right, adults have a right how to live their lifestyles, but we have a system, right, to protect children from abuse. And I think certainly, what I've heard, right, about some of these laws is that they are designed to protect the kids, essentially, and how the kids, may express themselves in school, which is, it comes off as, it's a protective environment from the whims of the state. Not the adult, the child at risk. This is criminal. He needs to go to prison, this judge. Yeah, nobody should be imposing a gender identity upon their kid, right? Like, it's kind of like, too, right? Like, of course, you hear, plenty about parents kicking, evicting their children because, they're lesbian or gay or transsexual, right? So literally just kicking them out of their homes. And unfortunately, the consequence of that so often is that it pits the young person into an even more vulnerable state. So, that is the debate. I certainly think that some of the questions around those laws have been kind of sensationalized. And I think certainly there's a lot of, very extreme people who view their kids kind of as a projection of themselves and who don't respect, children's rights to live their life, to feel who they are. And that's kind of the debate about trans or not trans, right? And like I do have my girlfriend has a family member who got very wrapped up in this issue, and it kind of radicalized her. And like it's radicalized other people. Like there was a man a year ago who literally committed a homicide because he grew so hateful about this. The judge is mentally unwell. I mean, judges aren't perfect people either. Orange County, just let off, rather it was a hung jury. One of the jurors did not want to convict the judge of shooting his wife, even though he pulled out a gun, was like, it's not a real gun, and then shot her, right? Like, sometimes these extreme examples, they dominate the discourse. It's a way to frame things, right? Like, did you hear about what happened, in so-and-so place? Versus, kind of the more fundamental issues of compassion. And, I mean, certainly, it came up the other day again in the Coachella Valley about the Border Patrol, because a principal would not allow the Border Patrol to attend the school fair. They said, certainly some students who are undocumented, feel threatened, right, by the Border Patrol. And so they wouldn't let them come to the school. And then the Border Patrol got upset on Twitter, and Coachella Valley School District backed down and said, okay, Border Patrol, you can come. I mean, I don't think that people are totally, easily affected, right? And like, obviously, there need to be some limits, right, about, say, gender surgery, right? Like, the kids have to be able to decide, right? They have to be, adults. You can't just like do that, right, to somebody. There's a choice there. And if you didn't know, right, like, back in the old days, they did used to castrate people. Quite often, they would become eunuchs. If you didn't know, that a eunuch, right, is somebody who is castrated. And this was a way of creating ostensibly servile people who could be, brought into the the servant lifestyle, who would, not resist. And that's kind of like where we're at. It's an interesting question. I think I'm getting slowly where I'm going. I need to not miss my turn off. But, I mean, obviously there's limits to some of this, and then there's, there's responsible limits, and then there's intolerance. And the more I think that generally it gets turned into a political football, the less productive whatever overall discussion about human rights, versus, society, right, that, it becomes. But I gotta get, it is no longer quite sunset time anymore here in freeway land. Coming up on the junction, here's my turn. As a Cyber truck comes behind me. I'd be worried though. If I had a kid who was transgender right now, or a family member, I would like be checking on them. I think it's just not healthy for society to have sort of social limitations by force. And I mean, certainly, one story I'd be really, really interested in is abortion, right? Because like the Supreme Court rolled back Roe versus Wade, and I'm certain there's a lot of talk, right, that women would have essentially losing that freedom to do, choose what to do with their bodies, would have to seek out riskier medical, paths in other states. And I don't know, I haven't seen as much follow-up reporting on that as I'd like. I think that story is kind of somehow fallen off, despite being, so important. I think it's kind of like people get more angry about the idea of abortion, than they do, right? That this is actually happening to people. It's a very kind of sensitive issue. I don't know. I wonder what happened to that one. I mean, you have to be like, from Indiana, like the struck ahead to want to think about these things. And like California, of course, is a liberal kind of, state. But I think certainly the federal government, for a lot of things, right? You're talking about passports, or people's medical decision making, that, there has to be some limit on that state power. And then too, of course, not everybody can do whatever they want. But I hope everybody's having a good day. Life will go on. One way or the other, we're all in this together. Another Cybertruck. I don't know. I don't think, I wonder what, like Thomas Jefferson or George Washington would have made of the Cybertruck. They'd be like, what is this? It certainly has a look. It doesn't have like an actual truck bed. It's kind of like a souped up SUV in some ways. Traffic. More traffic. Kind of getting to be that blue hour. It was an okay day. Kind of sunny, but not too sunny. Not particularly cold. Shades have to go. Visibility was getting down. And I mean, certainly like the question of like what happens next, right? If we're going through this period of social turmoil, right, of division over the top, hot button issues, of some people feeling, very despaired, other people feeling, like this is going great. How do we come through this? Do we come out better on the other side, or do we simply kind of like hit the skids and like things just kind of go on like on autopilot? That's kind of like where we're at. It's an interesting question. But it's kind of a pretty evening. People got horses. I mean, of course, animals, right? Like, it's kind of like, what's the difference between an animal and a human being? And the answer is reasoning, right? Like, ostensibly, right, human beings are reasonable people and, have greater faculties than horses do, or dogs or cats, or any other animal, right? We like to think, right, that humans are smart, even though there's a lot of indications that humans are not so smart. This trailer is from Texas. Texas, of course, being, a much more conservative place than California. Sometime I'm gonna have to go to Texas. I've never been to Texas. I'm sure I would mess with Texas. But supposedly, there's some nice parts of it. I mean, it's kind of like this like battle of the states that we're having, like California versus Texas. The hay just keeps coming out of this horse trailer, just tumbling out. Kind of like He's gonna pave the whole road with hay going back to Texas. Okay, horse show, that's enough. I wonder what brought them out. I got the other Civic coming up here. Heading off into the evening. Life goes on. And like, I mean, I certainly think the worst thing might be for society to start really seeing increased negative effects from this turmoil, right? Like, say, like, what if the suicide rate, starts spiking, right? Because people who are transgender start to feel very marginalized. I think I saw some headline about a person with an autism tattoo getting deported. There's just got to be a limit to which treating each other poorly is the solution. And that, compassionate treatment of others is more of a desired goal versus, kind of like, I call it divisionism. A purposive, intentional goal of dividing people. As a Cybertruck passes me by. I don't know an option on the Cybertruck to have an actual truck bed or not. They should call it the Cyber SUV, because it's not really a truck. It's a glorified SUV. Incredible. I know people were protesting Tesla dealerships again today. I'm going to get me to one of these Tesla dealership protests soon. See what people really think of Elon Musk. I mean, it kind of reminds me of the DeLorean. It's got the same vibe. Kind of sharp shapes. Oh, I see. Is that? I saw the lights. Okay, yeah, so the CHP is ahead, and there must be they're like intentionally slowing traffic down. He's doing the, when they drive in S formation, kind of intentional slowdown. Maybe they're clearing something. Nobody ever just rushes by the CHP. To bumper sticker or not to bumper sticker? That is the question. I don't know what's going on. Maybe an accident? We'll find out. But like, next on YouTube, traffic collisions. But it's Saturday. Slowly getting towards the darkness. Deep thoughts. I think people who wear glasses are just deep thinkers. At least sometimes. I mean, it's kind of like they think, right, the glasses make you smart. Glasses, I was a little kid. They realized in like 7th grade that I couldn't see the board in math class. So we figured it out. The world got a whole, more, much more crisp. Now we're at a dead stop, so I don't know, because he was doing the going nowhere. Life in Southern California is a life in traffic. And like, certainly like one thing, like, you are essentially separated. Oh, there goes more CHP. Maybe there was a collision or something, or something spilled. This guy's out of his truck now, like looking like, what's going on? Something went down. But deep thoughts. It's like the old Dana Carvey SNL sketch. What was it? It was I forget. Deep thoughts with Jack Handy, I think, something like that. Those were great. Saturday Night Live is not what it used to be. It used to be seriously funny. And like, that's one thing I've heard right too, right? Is that things are getting less creative, that society is becoming less sort of ingenious and more sort of predictable. And like, I've heard this about, say, like movies and televisions too, right? That they do not make as interesting and original shows anymore, or movies, that things are more predictable. The same thing over and over, remakes, reboots. That genuinely like original content is becoming harder to do. That it's more, set form. Same thing over and over and over. I'm going nowhere. This is where you go, check the Google map and see if I can get ahead somehow. There's one guy over here, he's trying to make his way off of the freeway. No, but somebody was letting him. Now we're going. Let's see what's up. I hope it's not a crash. I don't know. I mean, in some ways, right, the Cybertruck is kind of unique like that. Like, it's got certainly a little bit of creativity to it, but... Okay, there's Sheriff? CHP. The flares out. There's fire. And we're clear. I wonder what happened. I see more ahead. At a junction. Way to San Diego, the way to the desert. We're going to the desert. But, I mean, obviously you don't want to like fixate on like existential questions totally, but I do think it's good to think about, kind of the big picture questions sometimes. Oh, here it is. What is it? Oh, that's bad. A single car. So like a single car crashed into the side in the metal gating there. It didn't look. It wasn't a multi-car collision, so just one person losing control. But at least it looked like they were getting help. Whoa! He's like, I'm not sitting behind that trailer. Let me go. I can see the horse for a second. I don't know. I've ridden horses like long ago, and certainly like horse riding is, fun. I mean, very bumpy. Not quite, driving on the racetrack. or rather the death way that is freeway. And we spend so much of our lives on the freeway. Got the diamond lane. I mean, certainly, I hope that we become a more unified society. That, particularly the hatred of others, that leads to ugliness, whether it's online or in person or against inanimate objects, we don't see a rise of that. I don't think that hating people just to hate is usually productive. I mean, there's certainly, in fact, it's never productive. There's, certainly arguments to be made, right, that certain things are not good, right? That groupthink, that cult-like behavior is not beneficial. And then you get in this whole kind of debate about religious liberty, of course. And certainly one of the founding principles of the country was freedom of religion. And, it's literally codified into the Constitution. So of course, different religions and different faiths are going to have different kind of moral, frameworks, different practices. Some people are going to have, strong feelings about, things one way or the other. You certainly hear this kind of like line about, particularly, Muslims and other immigrants groups, that, they refuse to integrate, right, to be absorbed into American society. And, you see somebody in a burqa and you go like, well, how is that acceptable? And, do they have a choice? Does society need to tell Muslim people, right, no hijabs, no burqas? And like, this has been a big debate in the past, and usually it's just been very divisive. People who want to have their faith have a right to have their faith. But are there limits on that, right? Like, do the authorities have an obligation to intercede, right, when there is harm? The ultimate goal, right, is protection of the vulnerable, particularly from victimization. At what point, do you get the search warrant or, do the raid to rescue people for, a situation in which they are not in control of their lives? Kind of interesting, balancing, right, of individual freedom, of personal liberties, of responsibility of the state. It's kind of where we're at. It's slowly getting, it's not quite dark yet. Day will turn to night. It'll be another day and life will go on. But I certainly am truly deeply concerned about where this kind of anti-trans, anti-DEI crusade is going to go. If, rather than, making people feel accepted and, uplifted and tolerated and welcomed, does it simply have a negative effect on people? There was a yawn there. And I always like to think, generally that I have a positive effect. Certainly some people have tried very, very hard to portray me as like a negative. And I'm like, really? I mean, I guess, fear of each other goes so profound. And this is part of the reason why I have particularly avoided, getting too absorbed into the Israel-Palestine sort of conflict, for lack of a better word, is because it's so divisive. It's completely divisive. And certainly one of my big fears was that, the retaliation effect would be so huge to the activism that it would be hard to justify it in the first place. And USC, for its part in particular, has been very, very retaliatory towards the faculty and the students who took part in protests. And they've reacted by pitting fencing into the middle of campus, to literally fence out park space just so it can't be used for protests. And I mean, the sort of glorification and justification of physical violence around that has really had a long-term negative effect. And it hasn't resolved it. And it's just very disappointing to see so many people so committed to conflict on both sides, prolonging and protracting militant violence either on the basis of identity. Now I'm getting somewhere. That there should be, at least some desire for tolerance and for peace and for living with each other. And it's very disturbing. I mean, it literally is two sides that hate each other to such an extent that they, justify violence as an appropriate response. And that's kind of like where I always have drawn the line. I'm like, I don't ever want to be seen as endorsing violence or endorsing hatred. The positive model that I was raised to believe in. To want to think right that through nonviolence, through tolerance, through acceptance, that we can uplift each other and create a more positive, meaningful society for everybody. I got the headlights going now. It's that time. Getting out of the dusk and the sunset slowly towards a darker time of day. Night. Back to your supply chain. All that production from overseas going into the trucks, making its way through the hills here, out through the desert, and across the country to store shelves near you, to your grocery stores, fueling the economy, the greatness of America. I mean, one big thing, right, is that the economy, right now, but even before recent years, is becoming less productive for everybody, right? You have a whole bunch of people, particularly women and people of color, who are working very, very hard and not making a lot of money. And also, too, for whites in rural areas, the rural areas are getting very impoverished. And the kind of separation between the elites and everybody else, in some ways, is framing this cultural debate. And of course, Hollywood and the media have a role too, right? Kind of like what you see on television, the messaging, seeing people like you, how you understand the world around you through media, particularly, really, really matters. And they've had stuff. I don't know. Was my conversation there audible? Getting here kind of messes with it, but now I don't know if my audio is working. Into the night. Is my audio working, Ricky? Testing 1 2 3 audio. Life is a highway. Testing 1 2 3. Do we have audio? Audio check. Testing 1 2 3. Audio check. Testing 1 2 3. Audio check. Is my audio working? Audio? No audio? Audio? No audio? Ah, you're killing me. Quietude. I've always wondered if phone conversations patched to YouTube. Audio is good. Yeah. I always wonder, I'm like, if I get a call while I'm streaming and I take the call, does the call cross into the YouTube stream or not? One of those like smartphone things. So what's everybody doing? Is everybody having a good time? I'm in the darkness of life. Life is a highway. Where do we go? I don't know. I'm gonna be like Googling, like, do phone calls interrupt streaming or not? I know you can receive text while you're streaming. smartphones are pretty smart most of the time. Other times you're like, dang smartphones. I like it at night. I like a good night stream. And thank you, Judge Laura. I mean, personally, I have a great deal of respect for the judiciary sometimes. Other times you're like, what was that judge thinking? Sometimes for the attorneys, not usually. No problem. Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, the respect factor is really where we're at, right? Like, do we respect each other as people? And like, certainly, like, being highly disrespectful is highly entertaining. People, have a degree of flippancy and disrespect sometimes. Like, I think I just read that Japan is having problems, right, with over tourism and people making, essentially very flippant social media videos about, traditional sites and making a mockery, right, of things that, society as a whole, right, as a traditional culture views as sacrosanct, right? And like in America, unfortunately, like one of these seems to be, sexuality and gender, and then of course, identity, right? It's not so much, I think, that they don't like the immigrants, is that they feel that the immigrants are not sufficiently embracing, right, what we, term to be white American identity. And one field that I was always fascinated with is whiteness studies. And some people get offended by the idea of whiteness studies, but the study of kind of like how our American national identity, has come to be, and particularly around people who are of Anglo-Saxon origin, and then of course, right, you have further discussion, right, about people who you might, judge as white, who are of, say, Irish or Italian descent, and that is kind of like where we're at, right? Like we're like kind of like experiencing this whiplash effect, where the Anglo-American identity is really, really striking back against the DEI, against people who are trans, and it's going, you can't do that. You can't be like that. And it's really quite a question mark, as far as how this ends. If it just ends in greater division, or if we all start to get along, that is kind of like the $1 million question right now, right? Like, if you start messing around with society, do you make society better, or do you turn it into essentially a clusterfuck of some type, in which people are simultaneously feeling threatened and then afraid? And the fear factor, right? The fear factor of people who are different from you, it seems to be really, really going up in a way that I'm not even able to totally explain. It's kind of unfortunate, a byproduct of America's cultural conflict. And this, it goes against too, right? And like this stuff we don't really talk about enough is kind of like poor people, right? Hatred of the poor, of people who are simply of lacking means. The equation, right, that people who lack means must be lazy or incompetent, or not sufficiently productive. And then that gets really tied in with identity. You will hear people exclaim slurs like lazy so-and-sos, and that is kind of like connection between race and economy. And there's, of course, a very long history of this in the United States. Marginalization of different groups, of exploitation. But how we overcome that is really the question, right? Because, like, if you just start going, well, trans people aren't worth anything, they won't work. No wonder they're on the streets, selling their bodies and, doing drugs. I mean, homeless disproportionately. Do you just accept social marginalization, right? And, like, are you approving of it? Are you going, great, let's marginalize them. Let's make them, lesser. Let's make them, into a subpopulation that's deserving of harm, that is not worthwhile. And I think that's really the danger of Trumpism. That goal will be met. That we will literally start to crumble, and that fear of the other and the hatred, right, will really start to become very commonplace things, across the spectrum of different groups, right? And whether you're a woman, right, who once had an abortion, or if you're simply an African American who's feeling too proud, that you will be shamed by the dominant white culture into submission. And I think this is kind of where, like, people are, been talking about the pushback. And after the election, I went, there's going to be protests, and it didn't happen immediately, but people have started getting angrier, and started becoming a little bit more resistant, particularly in recent weeks, against this agenda of intolerance. And then you're seeing, right, sort of an economic protest, against Elon Musk and the Doge for cutting, so much of the government down so quickly and dispossessing people of their jobs. Particularly, people go, well, don't feel bad for those, bureaucrats, but it does have a harmful economic effect. Not all of those people are going to simply be reemployed. It's something that we don't, want so much. And I just hope we figure it out. Obviously nobody wants terrible things happening to somebody who doesn't deserve it. But I think, in a larger sense, we all kind of deserve, some reproach that we're not getting it done as a country. I mean, our collective failure and our collective success really depend on us. It's not a separation thing, it's a together thing. Sip of tea. I mean, certainly there's a lot of romanticism about American history, sort of creating an idealistic portrait of the past and using it, to justify the present. But it's got a certain mileage to it. I mean, you see people getting, in some ways nostalgic for it, but not really understanding the complexity of American history in meaningful ways. Kind of simplification. And I mean, certainly the last election, one of the big stories was that more people who are Latino and African American swung towards Trump, and ostensibly, at least in some people's opinions, right, were voting against their own interest. And so now people are being deported, on that basis, right? Like, oh, your spouse voted for Trump, and now, the partner is, getting deported. Or, right, they're deporting people who are totally law-abiding and positive and, positively contributing to our society, and what the benefit of that is, and like what the law says. But home is back to the desert, and I really love Coachella Valley. It's like 20% Canadian, 40% gay, and the rest is Latino, and snowbirds. Certainly has a very unique population makeup, even for California. I think Palm Springs might be the gayest city in America, next to San Francisco, perhaps. And like West Hollywood. But the intolerance isn't going to get us anywhere. It really is not. I mean, religions that teach a lack of compassion are really, really problematic. I mean, and like, kind of like the danger, right, of simply buying into blind belief is that you will be blind to yourself. What's up, Zippy? I'm gonna wave hi back. It's a little dark. But I mean, I think that's probably what's so clever about certain sects that have really cultivated themselves, on the idea, right, that by joining them that you'll be a success. That the religion itself isn't about faith, right, but about success. It's great. I think the Coachella Valley has a wonderful composition. It's sort of for weird reasons too. I mean, there's a history there that I'm still learning about how that all came about, and of course there's a lot of Native Americans out here too. There's a grand total of 10 different reservations, I believe, in this area. And that is really perhaps the greatest cultural value that we have out here. And I was at a lookout the other day, and I was reading the interpretive signs about the Cahuilla people and the different bands, the 10 different bands that comprise the Cahuilla tribe that is federally recognized, of course, and owns, controls what's left of land that they once had, and how they were able to be so much more self-sufficient than our modern society in a way that's really quite a bit. I mean, Americans' views, right, of Native Americans is its own interesting, psychological topic to get into, how we constructed our kind of past identity around this marginalization. And that's kind of like where we're at. I have, for one, have always tremendously respected Native American culture. I think they are amazing people, and we could learn so much from them. And like when you see, I mean, there's still at least one school around here that's got a name that makes you go, what? I'm in Steinbeck country. Great diversity, with the exception of Monterey, the Pacific Grove, and Carmel. Yeah, I mean, Salinas, right, is extremely agricultural. It's much like Imperial County. Salinas County and Monterey County are a really high, food and work production area. Yeah, I mean, California really did a good job of wiping out its indigenous culture, even more so than other states. Like Los Angeles County does not have a single reservation. The Tongva, don't have any formal land, holdings even, which is not the case in Riverside or San Bernardino or in San Diego County. San Diego County in particular has a lot of Native Americans, and it's really California's loss that we so effectively massacred our way out of having Native Americans. It's unfortunate. It's a loss. It's a societal loss for us. And I hope that, if nothing else, right, that perhaps maybe some of the respect will not, go away for different people. And I think particularly the Obama administration was trying to do some good work to uplift the Native American community. And of course, Trump seems to, care less. I mean, the Greenlanders are like, what are you doing, bro? Like, we don't want to be part of you. Not like that, we don't. We are Greenlanders. Like, I thought it was very arrogant to insinuate that the Greenlanders don't care about Greenland, and that they want to be absorbed into us in that type of way. I mean, that certainly is a great expression of American kind of nationalism. And I'm not so sure of some of these security arguments that are getting made. It is a beautiful dark night, though. I have been up to Monterey before, to Santa Cruz, very briefly. I've driven through Salinas. And I've driven down one a long time ago, which I don't think you can presently do because of the road collapses. And I mean, certainly California will, remain in place, but there's certainly very conservative pockets that can be found here. Yeah, I believe there's still some pretty serious road closures along Highway Drive. I mean, the majestic coastline of Big Sur, very beautiful, very nicely pricey. I've always wanted to go to Esalen. I hear they have some wonderful hot springs at the Esalen Institute. And to think about things at a higher level, philosophically, quite seriously, and to kind of bring ourselves together more. But it's dark. I'm coming to a close. And thank you, everybody. Shout out to everybody who participates, values this deep thinking. To the replay crew, and to people who want to see a better country, a better society. I hear great things about Esalen. It's a little pricey. Maybe I can get like a job there or something. I'm gonna take a look at that. You're inspiring me now, and we should want to be inspired. Yeah, I might be able to get on later. I'm on quite a series of missions. Good night, Judge Laura. Good night, Zippy. Good night to all the good folks who want this place to be magical and who want to see the world as it is, not as they would like it to be. So with that, everybody have a beautiful rest of your evening. Go get some dinner. Do something fun. Chill out with your families. Be good to each other. Don't be terrible to each other. Don't do that. And, it's a beautiful world that we live in. And we'll leave it with this empty desert road going slowly into this soft, dark night. I'm out.